compared what you're working on to an oracle, I guess I wasn't quite clear on what the data validation mechanism is, right? So let's say, you get like 100 climate scientists. How do you ensure that 51% of them aren't in some way caught in a way that would throw your data source, right?
This is such a good question. So the way that this works is that in general, this is true of inference. All that you have you have data and you have models, and then you can try and use those models in order to make sense of which data to trust, and you can use your data in order to make sense of which models to trust. And it's possible for a group of people to come and try and dominate some section of the data and models, but always it will be more expensive to try and maintain the fake data alongside the fake models than it will be just to live in relationship to what is, if that makes sense. And these will start to mount, right? The costs will start to mount systematically. There's an argument about conspiracies that goes along the same lines. It talks about how, so there's people that don't believe that the moon landings were real. And one of the ways to explore this possibility is to say that if that were true, then what would be the cost of maintaining all of that secrecy, right? How do you get 400 scientists to not one of them, like spills the beans with some sort of conclusive evidence or even like defecting and saying like, no, it was all faked. And what they point out is that like, as your surface area grows, the cost of maintaining a lie grows non-linearly, right?
I think it was like 1 million Americans total that ended up in some way being employed by NASA's move to the moon. I don't know if that number is validated. I don't have an oracle on that one, but that's the largest number that I heard, like employed in some way, right? And so, you think way beyond that 400 core scientists, right? You have to imagine that's a pretty heavy cost to maintain.
So it's a similar argument, which is just that it's much cheaper to be than to be dishonest when you're playing an iterated game. And it's not to say that it's capture proof, but that we already live in a world where the president of Stanford apparently is faking science. And part of what makes it possible for the president of Stanford to fake science is that the models that are being published and the data that's being published is not inspectable, right? It's only in the PDF. And so at least the best that we can do is we can increase transparency, and then we can also have additional tools for hunting for the fake data. And in fact, the rate of that occurring is ramping up. There's now a whole bunch of projects that are out there that are able to use natural language processing and machine learning in order to search for fake data, manufactured data, et cetera. And so the tools that we have in science for starting to search for this sort of thing are just getting better. And so a similar argument applies here, right? All that we can do is we can get better at finding out, what's fake and what's real. We build the data that we can trust, and we build the models that we can trust.
No, that makes sense. And maybe it gets us further than I'm thinking, but like what comes to mind is like in the case of the president of Stanford, he was incentivizing, let's say, bold breakthroughs, right? And if anyone's looking at the incentive mechanisms of that academic system, you can kind of conclude that he was inevitable, right? It's kind of shocking that it went all the way to like the top of like the Ivy League, right? And I think that's just what's shocking to people is that it went all the way there. But again, it's obvious if you look at the incentive mechanisms, right? You'd be like, no, this is probably happening all the way down. Why would you think this is isolated in any way and not just the norm of that system? And the reason I bring that up is because when you're gathering data, and let's say even, you want people to validate or depending on the case, it might be invalidate a data set. How do you change the incentives from the status quo where, if you want to get any funding, maybe this is a public goods question, but you have to be discovering something and you have to be making some type of bold breakthrough, and you're disincentivized from putting in like 3 years of work into disproving someone else or just validating someone else's bold claim that not factual.
Yeah, my best answer here is that we can build systems that check for dissonance inside of themselves. So that's the first thing. And what I mean by dissonance is, well, this is where Roth says, no, it's KL divergence, right? It's like, does this data fit with this model? Does this prediction, are we surprised, right? So surprise checking. And then we can have many systems. And so this is like the true definition of pluralism, is that we need to have many, many different systems that vary. They cannot be the same thing. They have to have different primitives that they rely on, and that they have some sort of abrasion between one another. And so that this is part of the argument for why we have three branches of governance in the United States. We have legislative, we have executive, and we have judicial, and each of them rely on different mechanisms, and they can each hold one another in some level of check, because of the fact that they kind of grate against one another. And it's that grating, it's that abrasion that helps us to smooth out the rough edges. The analogy to use here is to what are called true plates. And in order to find flat, it turns out flat is kind of hard to find. And in order to create a flat surface, one way that you can do this is you can have three different plates that you rub against one another. And with two, it's not enough, because you'll get these like kind of like curved shapes. But if you have three, then there's some theorem that says that there's only one path, that single path that cuts through three of these plates is a flat plane. And I think if you were in 4 dimensions, then it would be like, you'd need 4 plates. And so that is, I think a similar analogy applies here, is that if we want alignment between our government and their citizens, between our companies and their citizens, between AI and us as humans, then we want to have many different systems of many different kinds that are all keeping one another in check. And if we overcommit to any single one of them, then either because we don't have enough of different instances of them, or because we don't have enough variation in our approaches, then we're going to end up with one of them, totalizing and having some sort of externality that it imposes on the rest of the system. That's my only hope. And I say that because, an expression of humility that the approaches that I'm talking about here are not enough, and they're going to have problems, and they're going to have systematic problems. And they're probably better than, they're marginally better than what we already have. But, and so that's the expression of humility. But then the invitation is that we need more of them, right? We need everybody to build, you were talking earlier about idea market. So we need everybody to build their system, which plays its role in and to contribute to the overall story, because it's only when we have many different versions of these that are variant that we're going to be able to pick up all the different signals that need to be aggregated. And so and that's good news, right? Because there'd be nothing more horrible than running out of problems. We need things to work on. It's lovely to get to work on the important things. And so, don't invent fake problems. Don't worry, there will always be one. But also, like, to become too committed to the idea that the thing that you're doing is the final thing is the source of, right, every dystopia that has ever been imagined. And so the protopia view, as Kevin Owocki is trying to coin, instead of utopia, protopia, is that there are problems, that problems can be solved, and that when you solve the problem, there will be a new one. And so just, keep working at it. Another way to frame this, as I was just talking this afternoon, is negative optimism, is be optimistic about the far-flung future. And the way to get to that optimistic future is to be negative in the short term, and point out what all the problems are, and point out how to solve them, and point out why those solutions to those problems aren't going to be good enough, and so on. I know that that's not a satisfying answer, right? It's not going to be a perfect system, but maybe that means that's because you're going to make your own, which helps to contribute to addressing some of its shortcomings.